So Godzilla Minus One is the latest Godzilla film from Japan. Big distinction there because we have a lot more. We have had quite a slew of American Godzilla films that have been coming out lately. In fact, there's another one on its way again with King Kong once more. But the Japanese Godzilla films of recent, between this and the other film Shin Godzilla back from 2016. It's interesting to see how Japan has developed the giant monster in this new iteration, because it's between like Shin Godzilla and Godzilla Minus One, which I'm going to talk about. It always feels like these films are about something more than just the giant monster. Now, don't get me wrong. Godzilla is pretty cool in this film. You get to see him do the usual cool stuff that you expect Godzilla to do in a giant monster movie. But what makes this film more interesting, and what easily makes Godzilla Minus One one of the best Godzilla films of the 21st century, is that it feels like it's about something more than just the carnage and just the destruction and just about. And it's not just about, who can Godzilla punch next. It's actually, there's a human, as many people have mentioned. It's very much a human story, and you get that when you turn Godzilla into more of this force that represents something bigger that the humans have to conquer over, much like the original, which is why it's no surprise that Godzilla Minus One goes back in time to try to find something more to do with the era in which Godzilla was created. Because, as a lot of people have talked about with the original Godzilla, it was meant to represent this kind of, like this fear and anxiety that came about, after the war, and this lingering notion of just like destruction and terror. So it was very much, about something. It was as much a human story as it was a giant monster film, with the big rubber suit and Godzilla smashing up everything. And like I said, like with Shin Godzilla, it felt like it was about something more. Like it felt like it was highlighting the bureaucracy that would go on around handling a Godzilla attack, where it was gonna just treat it like it's a normal thing. And with Godzilla Minus One, it's more unique because you care a lot more for the humans in this story than you do Godzilla. I mean, Godzilla's cool. It's like this giant menacing force, but if he's supposed to be the villain, you've got to have human characters worth rooting for. And the human story within Godzilla Minus One is fully developed. So the story follows. It takes place after World War II, and Koichi Shikishima is a kamikaze pilot who basically chickened out. He tried to pretend that there was something wrong with his plane. He landed on a nearby island and just said, just chickened out. He said, I can't, fly to my death. I don't want to do it. And it made sense too at the time, because the war was almost over at that point, so there was no point in, throwing his life away. But he still had that guilt within him that he wasn't living up to something more. And that guilt is further exacerbated when the island comes under attack by Godzilla, and Shikishima is given a moment to kind of defend his troops and save the day, and he doesn't do it. He chickens out again, just because he's terrified of dying and would rather save himself than throw his life away for something that he doesn't feel would happen, because they're fighting Godzilla, and you know how it always goes with Godzilla. Oh, this weapon will work, and then, oh, guess what? That weapon didn't quite work as well as we thought it would. So from a survival standpoint, it makes sense why Shikishima, would flee, but at the same time, he feels guilt about not having, stuck up for everyone else and, tried to save the day in some way. So he tries to carry on after the war. So he ends up hooking up with Noriko and a little girl called Akiko. And it's basically, they've kind of formed this family bond out of tragedy, because they've seen so much death and destruction around them. They've lost their homes, they've lost their families, and this is all they have left. So they just kind of band together and kind of form this family unit. And as they try to survive, Shikishima is constantly traumatized by the war. Like, for him, it hasn't ended yet, and he has to find some means of trying to come to terms with the guilt about, about being a pilot who, didn't live up to the expectations of being a kamikaze pilot, and also not being able to stop Godzilla. Now, thankfully, or more or less thankfully, he's given the chance to defeat Godzilla again when he takes on a new job with a group of other former naval engineers who work on a boat trying to dismantle mines that have been placed in the sea. And while they're doing this, Godzilla pops up again in the waters, and they're tasked with trying to help out and make sure that Godzilla doesn't terrorize the rest of Japan. So Shikishima is given another chance to do this, but again, he's still terrified. And why wouldn't he be? Because they do set up Godzilla as a major threat. He's, at one point they're beating him back because they're like shoving mines into his mouth on this little rickety boat. But then, give Godzilla enough time and he'll use his atomic breath and just blow up, an entire battleship right in front of them. So, of course, the naval engineers, they come together and they realize they've got to find a better strategy to defeat Godzilla. And it requires, backup plans and then backup plans to those backup plans. But eventually, of course, they will end up defeating Godzilla because not just because they have to force back Godzilla so that he doesn't obliterate the rest of the world, but because it's thematically appropriate for all these naval officers feeling that there's lingering elements of the war that they have to get out of their system, and that they feel like they have to live up to something more, especially in an environment where they feel like they've been cast aside. Throughout the film, that there's this, they constantly bring up the fact that that Japan has just kind of tossed them to the wayside. Even at one point, when on Shikishima's boat, when they're dismantling mines, they realize they're meant to slow Godzilla down, and that they're more or less like bait. They're just meant to slow him down, and they could end up as casualties. And they're just kind of oh yeah, that's typical. That's what they've always done with us. So there's this feeling that there's so much anxiety that lingers on from the war, and distrust within the military, and living up to the expectations of protecting everyone when it feels like that's not even happening, with all the problems that happen in post-war Japan. So you're kind of rooting for Shikishima because, he loses a lot, and even as he's struggling to fight back against Godzilla, there's the closer that he would get to a victory, there's always a little bit of defeat along the way, and these feelings that, that he's basically just helpless. There's nothing he can do at certain points. At one point, it feels like he's lost everything, and an entire city is decimated, and he's just reliving the same trauma again, and just breaks down in that moment. And it's just, and your heart goes out to him that, that by the time you get to the third act, you're kind of cheering him on to make sure that, as he keeps saying throughout the film, that he can finish this war within himself, as the film keeps going. So yeah, it's very much a human story, and I love how much time we get to spend with Shikishima, as well as a few other characters, like the tech engineer of Kenji is really interesting. What's his name? Shikishima's former engineer superior also comes back into the picture, but it takes some convincing to basically building up trust again, which I guess is a bigger theme throughout the film, because by the end, when Godzilla is finally defeated, there's this sensation that, that all these people have come together, and that they've kind of learned to build up trust again, especially when it's dwindled in such short supply, when trying to handle this, this apocalyptic situation with Godzilla on their hands. So very much a unique and intriguing human story that that even the many times that Godzilla is not on screen, it's still a fascinating drama to watch unfold. That being said, if you are coming into this film looking for Godzilla action, you will get a lot of it. There's a lot of the classic Godzilla city stomping with great detail. He smashes up buildings, get to see people get crushed under his feet. You get to see his atomic breath, and oh my god, when Godzilla unleashes his atomic breath, and you see, and when you see his back glow and just kind of shoot up, like an energy reactor starting up, about to emit this giant explosion from his mouth. It's exciting. It's still, like even when I was watching with like the American Godzilla films, whenever they do that, it always gives me goosebumps just for like the build up and the anticipation to like the big giant explosion. And then of course when it happens in this film especially, you feel like that power there, because like Godzilla's destruction is just horrifying with like with how much carnage he causes and how much human misery you see come about with it. So it's very much like a Godzilla film with stakes on the line, where you're not so much rooting for him, especially when you've gotten used to these characters enough that you don't want to see them just get crushed under Godzilla's foot. So yeah, you're as much intrigued by Godzilla as you are with the human element of the story. And I want to frame this by saying that even though I love Godzilla Minus One, I'm not opposed to more of like the wrestling match Godzilla films, where it's less about the human story and more about who's Godzilla gonna attack in the next film, which Japan has done a ton of. So it's not just like an American thing with our current monsterverse, whatever you want to call it. But for as fun as those films are, like they're fun, and like like they're fun like candy. Like they're not that they're not that like great for you on like a human level, but they're just kind of like fun to watch the carnage and action unfold. But with Godzilla Minus One, I was surprised by how much I found myself invested with this story, where it doesn't just feel like busy work for our human characters to do before Godzilla gets on the screen. It's like, especially the actor who plays Koichi Shikishima, Ryunosuke Kamiki, is just amazing with like how he goes from from being very cowardly to being very traumatized to being very conflicted about how he feels about trying to move on with his life at one point. Like there's this constant like will he, won't he with Noriko, when it seems like it should be obvious that they should take their relationship to the next level. Like they've already proven themselves that they can raise a kid. So you're kind of waiting for that moment as well, but you're also rooting for them because it's something that Shikishima feels like he hasn't quite earned yet, because he's terrified of others being reliant on him, because he feels like he's just gonna run again. And not in kind of like it's like very much like an instinctual thing where he doesn't want to die, obviously, so you gotta flee from Godzilla, but at the same time you don't want to see other people die. So it's this very big internal struggle with Shikishima that makes him such a fascinating character, and really make you root for him in the end, where it's basically just of course, you can kind of see where this is going. It's gonna come to a showdown of Shikishima versus Godzilla, so that we can kind of bring this war to an end, and it ends so beautifully with this big battle at sea, where they're trying to find the most scientific way to destroy Godzilla, and it requires everybody working together to make sure that they can save the day and that nobody else dies under this carnage. So yeah, on that level, Godzilla Minus One is easily the best Godzilla film of the 21st century.